Hi everyone, and welcome to Food Systems 101 workshop. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday. We hope that your morning or early afternoon is going well, depending on where you are. Yeah, we're excited to learn together about some things that we see as key in the food system and to have a little bit of a conversation around that. So to introduce ourselves, my name is Jess. And I am the Good Food Campus lead for Western Canada. So I am from Lekwungen and Wasanich territory, which is in Victoria, BC. And in that acknowledgement, I just want to also acknowledge the fact that as a white settler, I have unwarranted privileges in line with that. And so as we explore the food system in relation to colonization later in this presentation, it's important to remember its ongoing and systemic nature in all areas of society. And so something that we can do to respond to that is to respond to calls to action that are made by Indigenous people and to build relationships with the Indigenous peoples and communities around us. And in the words of Dwayne Gladue, who opened our session yesterday, just thinking about who must we be to make this better. So to go over what we'll be doing in the session, at first we'll be doing an introduction to food systems and some key terms. Then we'll go over a section called Power in Food, and then Reclaiming the Food System, Pillars of Good Food, and then finally we'll go over student mobilization for good food. And so to start things off, I'm going to be going over some key terms now. So to give folks some background about food systems in general, and of course these are not the only key terms that matter, but they're some of the ones that we thought that were the most important to share. So keep in mind at the end, I'm going to ask, if there's any terms that we're missing. So throughout it, you can think about that as well. But to start it off, I just want to ask the first question. So what does a food system mean to you? So I'll give everyone a minute to put that into the chat. If you can just say, in general, anything that comes to mind, what you think a food system is. Yeah, so this is great. So I'm seeing a lot of things coming in that are really taking into account the full nature of a food system, right? So the whole chain of production from where it's grown to the people that are supplying it and all the steps in between. Food and land. Yeah, this is great. So yeah, everyone, is on the right track in terms of seeing it as a holistic system, and paying attention to the whole chain is important. So if you could go to the next slide, Jamie, please. So yeah, a food system in general encompasses all those activities that are related to the production, so the cultivation, the rearing, and the capture, for example, processing, refining, manufacturing, distribution, so transportation, sale and retail, preparation, and the consumption of food. So something to keep in mind here, of course, is that food systems vary across political and cultural lines in terms of the way that they're structured. So in general, a food system encompasses these things, but it does look different depending on where you are. Okay, next slide. So the second term that we wanted to go over was food security. And so it's a commonly used term in food systems work. And one definition that we find useful was actually developed by the Ryerson Center for Studies in Food Security. So it's called the 5 A's of food security, which are the availability, so sufficient food for all people at all times, accessibility, physical and economic access to food for all at all times, Adequacy, so access to food that is nutritious and safe and produced in an environmentally sustainable way. Acceptability, so you have access to culturally acceptable food, which is produced and obtained in ways that does not compromise people's dignity, self-respect, or human rights. And then agency as well, so the policies and processes that enable the achievement of food security. So something in relation to our work that we found in a study was that 76% of students disagreed that food on campus helps them maintain a healthy diet, and 64% reported that healthy food options are unaffordable to them. So on campuses, quite a number of people and students are experiencing at least some degree of food insecurity. And so the next term is food justice. So food justice, again, has a variety of definitions and contexts that need to be considered. But overall, it focuses on the racialized, gendered, and economic barriers in food production and consumption. So it's a lens that folks can use to analyze both international and domestic supply chains as injustices occur throughout every level of the food system. So a key component of food justice are questions of who has access and control, and how and where food is produced, as well as how the land is considered. So just as food systems take into account sustainability for communities and the earth. And in relation to campuses, these issues can create food insecurity, which disproportionately impacts students with children, Indigenous, racialized, and international students, further increasing the barriers to accessing education. So in relation to food justice, food sovereignty encompasses the decision-making power and control over a people's food system and their right to democratically determine their own food and agricultural policies. So it includes food security, but it also encompasses a political and deeply social element to it in terms of a nation or a people's ability to determine what their food system looks like. So there's no single way to define food sovereignty, but most often there's a focus on regaining control over Indigenous food systems following colonization in a way that connects with local Indigenous ecosystems and economies. There is also often embedded values of giving, sharing, trading, and land care as central pillars to Indigenous food systems around the world. And so one example of this is La Via Campesina. So they defend peasant agriculture, food sovereignty, and social justice among Indigenous people, migrants, farmers, landless people, and rural women and youth. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about production methods in the food system. So conventional food, crops can be considered conventional when they use synthetic chemicals such as fertilizers and pesticides and seek to create the maximum efficiencies throughout the production process. So the ultimate goal, more often than not, is to be producing the maximum crop yield and the maximum profit as well. So this can include seeking efficiencies with space and feed when it comes to animal agriculture, for example. And there are often many negative impacts of conventional agriculture when it doesn't take into account people and the earth. So this is things such as environmental degradation. So for example, under conventional agriculture, soil is depleting more than 100 times faster than it can rebuild itself. And this can also mean poor working conditions for food producers and poor living conditions for animals on concentrated feeding operations. So another example and a stat that we have here is that 33% of global fish stocks are overfished and unlikely to be restored in the near future. So these are the issues that sort of arise when the focus is on maximizing profit and capital and efficiency in the market. So conversely, on the flip side of things, next slide, please. It's called an agro ecosystem. So considering a farm as an agro ecosystem refers to planning farms to act like and interact with ecosystems. So instead of chemical inputs, energy flows such as water, sunlight, and nutrients that are natural are harnessed via nature in order to produce healthy crops. So it's really important to note here that Indigenous people around the world often grew and continue to grow food in this way before this term kind of took hold in Western academics and science. Okay, so after going over these terms, it would be great to input into the chat if we missed anything or any of your thoughts, and I'll just give you guys a minute to write those in there. Mainly if we missed a term, please let us know and then we'd be happy to include it next time. Great. So yeah, if you continue to think about things throughout the presentation, you can feel free and say, oh, you know, I just thought of this term and it would be great if you included it next time, but we can continue going forward. So the next section, I'm just going to introduce it and then I'm going to pass it off to Brittany, but it's called Power and Food. So we're going to explore the dynamics of power and control in the food system. And to start that off, the first thing that we want to go over is a short history of the food system in relation to colonization and industrial food. So the goal of this timeline is to reflect the connection between colonization and the industrialization of the food system, which has now led to corporate consolidation and concentration in the present day. So the timeline actually reflects what's called food regime theory. So we're not going to discuss, that in detail, but it essentially breaks down our food system historically in order to reflect the different concentrations of political power that have controlled much of the global system over time. So to start, between 1870 and 1930, settler colonies around the world were imposed by European countries, and the combined tropical imports as well as grains that were coming from different areas around the world were directed to Europe. So this global colonial economy then led to increasing urbanization and the emergence of European industrial classes. So food was very tied to that development. As time went on, traditional agricultural networks and economies were often wiped out in many cases or severely degraded. So while international trade and private property laws became entrenched globally, these were favoring European development through oppressive structures. After World War II, the US became a new global superpower, and production shifted again to facilitate large-scale industrial farms, such as those for animal agriculture. So many industries that are now central to conventional agriculture were also born from the world wars. And so, for example, DDT, which is now banned in many parts of the world, became a widespread pesticide for many years and was originally used to kill lice among soldiers during World War II and had other uses in the military as well. So it's interesting to note about how the military industrial complex facilitated its distribution and widespread use as a pesticide later on. And there's other examples of that. So if you're interested, you can look up other examples as well. So, for example, chemical weapons and technologies that were used in the military are in this way deeply connected to the pesticide industry. So then following that, in the 1950s to 1970s, we saw the rise of modern capitalism and mass industrialization. So that was coupled with free trade principles in the market as well. This is now accumulated into what's called a neoliberal and globalist economy. So those might be terms that you haven't heard before, but they essentially favor deregulation, so a lack of rules, free trade, and corporate freedom in the marketplace, which has now led to corporate consolidation of the food system. So what that means is that large corporations are able to buy up smaller businesses and ultimately control larger shares of the market. Okay, and I'm going to pass it off to Brittany, who's going to talk a little bit more about who controls the food system specifically.
Hi, everyone. So as Jess explained in the last slide, corporate control over our food has been increasing. Currently, only a handful of companies that you can see on the slide there control the way that most of our food is produced, processed, distributed, and in general, what food is made available to us and how. Corporate control can have significant impacts on our food system. Just for one example, in Canada, the National Farmers Union is currently resisting attempts by a multinational seed company, to control seeds through a project called Seed Synergy. This project would require farmers to pay royalty fees each year that they use seeds developed by these companies, even if they grow and save the seeds on their farms. This would make farming more expensive in general for the profit of large corporations, and seriously impact organic and ecological farmers trying to save and grow new organic varieties of these seeds, and overall would decrease seed biodiversity on Canadian farms and in the Canadian food system. So it's just one example of how corporate control can really influence the way that our systems are built and structured. So it's important to pay attention to. Can we go on to the next slide? Often we hear that big agriculture and corporate food is more efficiently produced and can therefore then more effectively feed the world. In reality, the majority of the world's food, depends on small scale producers, which is produced on much less land than big agriculture or big food. The main concern for big food, as Jess alluded to before, is profit for corporations, which often comes at the exploitation of food producers and workers all around the world. For one example, coffee farmers receive less than 10% of the retail price for coffee, and even less so for a cup of coffee, and have little power in determining coffee price in contracts. Forced child labor is, as you probably all know, is also very prevalent in chocolate production. So those are just two examples of that. So if we can go to the next slide, corporate control over our food system is also significant in Canada. On average, farmers spend 95% of their revenues on farm inputs from big companies like seeds, chemicals, equipment, and also have significant bank debts, leaving them with just 5% of their farm profits at the end of the year. A handful of farms make up the majority of national profits. So that means a small amount of farms are actually large enough to control the share of the profits, where most are struggling to make ends meet. They're struggling to small and family farms are struggling to keep up with the cost of farm inputs, debts, and competition with other big farms and industrial food. As a result, we have lost 1/3 of our family farms in the last 30 years in Canada. The picture is also similar for small scale and community fisheries, which have been struggling to compete with commercial fisheries. It is also important to note that our food production in Canada largely depends on migrant farm workers, as we all heard about this summer in the news. And they are often underwage, experience precarious working conditions, and are often unable to access a pathway to immigration. And during COVID have been in very difficult situations, and we've seen outbreaks in the living conditions. And you could follow, I have another slide where I'll show you an organization that you can follow to learn more about that. So now when we get to campus food, it's also mostly controlled by these major corporations that you can see there. So there's Chartwells, Aramark, Sodexo, and as well as Dana Hospitality, which is a newer food service company. Contracts with these companies are often strict and focused on profit, rather than providing food that meets the needs and wants of students. Often they will make money from buying food from certain suppliers over others, making it difficult to shift towards more sustainable, healthy options. As a result, some campuses are deciding to operate their own food services, which we call self-op, and also some students are opting to run their own food projects, which Jamie's going to talk about a little bit later. It's important that we know who has control over our food on campuses or in the world at large if we want to be able to ask for changes and actually hold them accountable and advocate for what we need and want. In general, Canadian campuses, food services on Canadian campuses actually generate $1 billion in sales each year. So I think that that's really important to know that there's a huge profit that's being generated here. And one thing we like to think about is like, what impact would that have if we actually shifted to the type of food that we believe in and that upholds our values? What impact would that have on the food system at large? And also because the reason why it's generating so much profit is because student needs and wants aren't being put first, but rather the profit of these companies. If you can go to the next slide. So in the faces of all the challenges in the food system that we have discussed, people have been imagining what a better, more just food system could look like. On this slide here, I have listed many organizations that are working on building movements to put control over food back in the hands of people, but both in the hands of food consumers and food producers. So you'll see a bunch of organizations. These are all Canadian that I've listed here. On the left side, we've listed some national organizations that are working on making good, healthy food more accessible to everyone. I would recommend checking out each of them on social media and their websites. These organizations have also been instrumental in advocating for a national food policy for Canada, which is supposed to help Canada build a healthier and more sustainable food system. And we're looking forward to seeing how that develops over time, as it's a newly released policy that's still in the works. But what's important is that all of these organizations have been working together to advocate for something. So it's really important that they're there, and they all have important things to say if you want to follow and learn more about them on social media or join their causes. On the right side, I've listed national organizations more involved with how our food is actually produced. I would highly recommend checking out the National Farmers Union to learn more about sustainable agriculture and family farms. A lot of the statistics that I mentioned in previous slides about Canadian farms, as well as the campaign against the Seed Synergy Project, are from the National Farmers Union. They recently released some interesting reports, so I would check that out. To learn more about issues facing migrant workers, as I mentioned before, and to help advocate for better working conditions, I would recommend checking out Justice for Migrant Workers on social media and amplifying any of their calls to action. All of these organizations and many more across the country make up a vibrant food movement that's fighting for a more just, sustainable, and equitable food system. And there are plenty that are also regional and local organizations. If you need help finding ones in your area, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll give you some suggestions. You can also look at the slides and click on that link there at the bottom, and you'll find a list from the Community Food Service of Canada. They've got a list of organizations, not complete, but a good list of organizations around the country. So there's these large national food movements that are happening, as well as local and regional, but there's also food movements that are happening on campuses that, as I'm sure you're all aware, and why you're ended up here. Students in general with meal exchange and outside of meal exchange have been imagining what a better, more just food system could look like, both for themselves and for everyone involved in the chain of food production. On this slide, you can take a look at it. We've added some of the things that we've heard from students that they want to see in a good food system. So that food upholds their health and well-being on campus and is affordable and accessible, that our oceans are protected, that farmland is protected, that farmers are making enough income, that they're fairly compensated, that there is good working conditions for food workers. So I would highly encourage you to check this slide out after the presentation that I think we set the link around. And if you have other ideas, feel free to send them. We're always interested in hearing what people think about what they believe a good food system should look like. So if you could go to the next slide. In order to articulate what we mean by good food, students involved with meal exchange over the last few years have defined pillars of good food that uphold their visions and values of good food and food systems they want for their campus and the food system at large. It's really important to define what you mean by the good food that you want to see in order to be able to create change and action around it. We have to say, what kind of food is it that upholds these values? And so that's what we've been trying to do at Meal Exchange by articulating these pillars of good food. So we could go to the next slide. The first one here that we have is accessible. It is important that we make sure that good food is accessible and all students are able to eat with dignity, sustained by affordable, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. Could go to the next slide. Generally, community-based food is produced locally within the campus's province by small and medium-sized businesses. And a really important aspect of this pillar is transparency, in that we can identify the farms or fisheries that produce the food. And the aim of this pillar is really to support local economies and food producing communities. The next pillar we have here is socially just. In general, socially just food guarantees that producers receive fair compensation for their products and have fair and safe working conditions. Ecologically sound food is produced using environmental stewardship practices that promote soil health, biodiversity in crops, seeds and wildlife, and ecosystem conservation, as well as reduce the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And last but not least is our humane pillar, which ensures that animals are raised in a way that accommodates their health and natural behaviors, provides free access to appropriate food and water, and minimizes stress and harm. So I would recommend, if you want to learn more about that, to take a look at this presentation afterwards, and you can read all the details there. You can also reach out to us to read something that we call the Good Food Guide, which has the standards and certifications that uphold these pillars of good food. But we'll always be happy to talk about that more. I'm now going to turn it over to Jamie, and she's going to explain how we can actually make this change that we want to see in the food system happen on campus.
Thanks. Just making sure I'm not muted. Cool. Yeah, so bound by this bold vision of a good food system, we've really seen a lot of amazing student power and leadership have done a lot in the last over the last few decades that Meal Exchange has been around to improve their campus food system. So in this section, I want to take some time to highlight what inspiring student leadership can look like and really explore what it looks like on the ground. So there's a few different approaches students can take to create change. One approach we've seen a lot of success from is student research on campus food issues. So for a long time, we knew that student food security was a major issue. However, without the data, we couldn't really put a number on the problem. That's where the Hungry for Knowledge report came in. So this was a student-led research initiative supported by Meal Exchange that aimed to better understand the experience of food insecurity among students in Canada on a larger scale. So there were some smaller studies on specific campuses prior to this report. But now compiling data from, I think, over 7 campuses across the country, this report has found that nearly 40% of students are experiencing moderate food insecurity, and 8% of students are experiencing severe food insecurity. So severe food insecurity involves going days or skipping meals without eating. So kind of a more at-risk behavior that can have major implications for health and well-being. This 8% statistic is nearly 3 times the rate of the general Canadian population. So these numbers are quite disturbing, but they also told us something we knew for a long time, and they have allowed students on campuses to better advocate for their needs. And we have also seen, a few select campuses, campus administrations taking this on as a more serious issue as a result of the research. But of course, there's still a lot of action to be taken, which is why we're all here today. Similarly, the Campus Food Report Card measured the success of universities in providing local, sustainable, healthy, and accessible food as rated by students and campuses themselves. So what was found was a huge, probably not surprisingly, a huge disconnect between student satisfaction with campus food and what campus administration and food services thought they were providing. So I've linked both of these reports actually in this slide. So if you have a copy of the slides, I encourage you to check out more of the interesting data from the Campus Food Report Card, because it really highlights just how big this disconnect is. But a stat to highlight here is that 76% of students disagreed that food on campus helps them maintain a healthy diet, and 64% reported that healthy food options are unaffordable to them. So again, this really highlights the disconnect that there seems to be, and the fact that there's no affordable, healthy, diverse food that meets people's well-being on campus. Not that there's none, but that there's a lot of work to be done, and that there needs to be more student input and diversity in the food served on campus. Another way students have mobilized for a good food system is by advocating for change in the food campuses purchase and serve. So kind of building off of the findings of the previous report. So recognizing the large purchasing power of campus food, as Britt mentioned, $1 billion, students have been engaging with their campus administration in the Good Food Challenge and Good Food for All campaign over the last several years, supported by Meal Exchange. So this has involved student leaders advocating and negotiating with their campuses to make more accessible, just, and sustainable food available to students. Many campuses have seen a shift in the conversation around good food due to this campaigning, and 2 campuses have made commitments to increasing their good food purchasing, including St. Jerome's University and the University of Victoria Student Society. So similarly in the US, something that's called the Real Food Challenge, so real is basically the same as good food. They've successfully seen 80 campuses committing to purchasing good or real food due to student campaigning, and this has shifted nearly $80 million a year towards good food purchasing. With the pandemic pushing the future of campus food into question, as well as many learnings we've had through our student leaders involved in the campus food organizing space in the context in Canada, we've been reevaluating the Good Food Challenge campaign as it has existed so far, and we're really excited to launch a more holistic and evolved program for student leaders to get involved with later this fall. In addition to student research and campaigns, on-the-ground initiatives aiming to support student food security have played a vital and central role over the last couple of decades for students in Canada. So campus food banks have sprung up on nearly every campus in the country in response to the huge number of students experiencing food insecurity. So these food banks are almost entirely, most of the time, but not always, student-led and run. And often, due to their position within student unions, they are student-funded as well. Campus food bank coordinators have worked tirelessly to respond to the need for food among their student communities, while often facing barriers around resources, support, and capacity. Though many campus food banks face these barriers, the student leaders involved in them are the most in touch with the student community and understand the lived experience better than anyone else. Over the past several years, many campus food banks have been pushing the envelope to offer a better access to food for students. So they recognize that food banks are an important service, yet an incomplete solution to food insecurity, and that advocacy is needed, and that their programming could be altered a bit to provide a more dignified space for students. So there's many examples, but I'm just choosing to highlight one. The Food Collective Center at McMaster University started as a food bank, and they offer a range of community programming beyond their food bank, including a free soup lunch program called Ladles of Love, which is the cutest name ever. They offer a good food box program, which is filled with low-cost produce for students to subscribe to, as well as some other programs. Recently, they launched a social media campaign to engage their community in important conversations around race, culture, and food insecurity. So these are just some examples of the ways campus food banks have begun to expand what they do. Beyond campus food banks, there are a range of alternative student food initiatives that increase access to good food. So the Loaded Ladle at Dalhousie in Halifax is a really inspiring example and something I look up to a lot of the time. What started as students occasionally serving free food on the sidewalk to students has grown into a full full-fledged student organization with their own kitchen and space. They offer daily free meals to students that are healthy and culturally diverse and that really emphasize good food. In addition to meal offerings, the Ladle runs a variety of other educational programming, workshops, and creates space for intersectional dialogue around food by hosting what they call solidarity servings. So the community-driven nature of the Loaded Ladle, as well as the important infrastructure that they have in place, allowed them to respond swiftly to support students when the pandemic hit. So through a partnership with Meal Exchange, the Loaded Ladle mobilized their relationships with local farmers and their team's capacity to get free local food boxes to hundreds of students in Halifax throughout the summer. So a student board member from the Ladle is joining us on a panel on Tuesday night. So I'll let them speak more to this excellent work at that time, and feel free to tune into that panel to hear from them with some other awesome community organizations as well. Another example of student mobilization was the launch of the Ryerson Students Good Food Market and the Lakehead Students Good Food Box. With the support of the Meal Exchange national staff through a project called Students Feeding Change, student leaders on these campuses conducted really broad consultation with students to see what food supports they wanted to see on their campuses, what their needs and values were, and then these student leaders put their findings into action. So the Ryerson Students Good Food Market, pictured here, is a student-run initiative offering low-cost, culturally diverse produce to students on campus. Likewise, students at Lakehead ran a Good Food Box program so that students in Thunder Bay could access fresh food on campus at an affordable price. This is an initiative that these student leaders hope to grow into a lasting grocery market on campus, recognizing that physical access to food was a huge barrier in Thunder Bay, and in particular for students at Lakehead. While there are so many examples of inspiring student food organizing across the country, my hope is that this has provided a sort of broad overview of what is possible and what sorts of initiatives can really make an impact in campus communities. So now that we know student organizing for good food is possible and impactful and inspiring and important because students know their community best, wanted to take a moment to present some of Meal Exchange's thoughts. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about who we are and what we do. We have been thinking a lot about the change students demand to see in their campus food systems. It's very bold. We learn a lot from students. And then we've also been reflecting on the key approaches we can take to get there together. So this, in essence, is the theory of change. What is our goal and how do we want to get there together? Which we're excited to share more with you at a session next Saturday. For now, I'll just talk a bit about our approach and how we aim to elevate student power in the work we do going forward. So the first core element of our work is to empower students and create space for the student voice to be heard. Too often, students are left out of decision-making in campus food, and we see a key part of our work is to make sure that student leaders have a seat at the table and are actually being involved to changes in campus food systems. So through our Good Food Campus program, launched later this fall, student leaders will be involved in Good Food Campus committees. So these are comprised of stakeholders from across the campus food system to lead changes in campus food and initiate innovative solutions to student food security together. We really see our role as facilitators of collaboration on and between campuses. Ultimately, students know what the student community needs on their campus in any given context, and we can play the role in supporting the student voice to come to the table with the folks that are currently in control of the campus food system. As we mentioned, the big problem we're trying to address is the fact that students currently don't have a lot of power, but that there's lots of opportunity for that to be regained. So they need to be brought to the table with administration and food services. In addition, we hope to play a role in connecting a network of campuses, and we already do play a role, but we hope to re-emphasize this in our work, the importance of a network of campuses, as well as food sector leaders and other community organizations that can share best practices, learn and network with one another. As you probably have all even seen just over the last few days, the barriers that a lot of students and campuses face are similar across the country, and there can be a lot of value in bridging these relationships to learn and advocate together. Lastly, and really importantly, we believe we have an important role to play in supporting students and campuses to create innovative solutions that increase access to good food on campus. And we're excited to support student leaders to be at the forefront of these initiatives through our Good Food Campus program, launching later this fall. This is really drawing from our previous work on a variety of different projects, including the role we played when the pandemic hit, coordinating food support for thousands of students across the country. So with that, I want to invite you to dive a bit deeper with us next Saturday. We'll be going through our theory of change and inviting you to get involved, and we're really excited to get your feedback as well. So that's next Saturday from 12:30 till 1:30 EST. In addition, I can highlight two super awesome and fun ways to get involved with us in the year ahead: the Food Justice Learning Circle and the Communal Lunch Project. So we'll be hosting info sessions for these next week as well, I think Tuesday and Wednesday, so that's part of the summit program. All three of these sessions will be recorded and posted online on YouTube after the summit, so if you happen to be busy, you can definitely catch up with us later on that. Awesome, so it looks like we're under time, which is so surprising. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for this workshop. We do have an anti-oppression training next, and we'll take a little bit of a break, so we regroup at 2 p.m. EST. You can check out that Google Doc with all the Zoom links. There's a separate room for that one, just because we were recording this workshop, so we can't anyway, we can't reuse this room. I do realize we missed a poll, so I thought we could do that now if people are open to that. It's around the who controls our campus food systems, and we're really curious to hear, you know, what companies seem to be dominating of the folks in the room, or, you know, we can even have a conversation around if you don't know who controls your campus food. So I think I'll launch that one now. I forgot to add Dana Hospitality. My bad.
If you're Dana Hospitality, maybe just chat it.
The votes are coming in. Has everyone got a chance to fill it in? I haven't seen some votes come in a while, but maybe I'll end the polling. Can people see the results? Yeah. Looks like we have a lot of Chartwells, Aramark, no idea. I've also been there. I was actually involved a lot in my campus food bank and student food security work when I was a student. And I remember going, having a conversation with someone, and I was like, what do you mean? What is that company that I've never heard of that has all this control? I feel like Jess and Britt, you might have a better idea, but what's a good way to find out? I think a quick Google search sometimes helps, but sometimes it's sneaky.
Yeah, usually you can search your campus food services online and be able to find that information. But sometimes you're right, Jamie, it is difficult to find out, which is, you know, part of the whole issue around the power and control. If you don't know who's in power and you don't know who's in control, then how do you make change, right? It was the same for me. My first summit a few years ago when I was a student, I found out about these companies, and somebody said, I believe it was Aramark, and they were saying that Aramark made more than McDonald's the year previously because they service jails as well as hospitals as well as campuses, right? So they're massive corporations, and to never hear their names is pretty shocking. But it also is normal if you don't know, because it's somewhat intentional, it feels like sometimes, to have that not public.
Yeah, I think it's really important to as the first step to, if you're wanting to get involved in changing anything about your food on campus, is to figure out who it is. And if you can learn, it's hard, but learn a little bit about when the contract is coming up, what are some major pieces in there. You might have to work with other folks in order to figure that out. Maybe your student union should know. Also, we would probably be able to help you figure it out. We have all sleuthed around to find out what company is on any given campus. So if you reach out to us, I'm sure we could help you figure it out, or direct you in the direction of someone else who might be able to give you some insight, or might be wanting to change your food on campus as well.
Yeah, pay attention to when we launch this Good Food Campus program. We won't be launching that on every single campus, but we'll have a variety of different activities that you can get involved with that link into this work. But if you're interested, you can be in touch and see if we're doing the more in-depth sort of procurement work on your campus as well.
Totally. You can also feel free to use our Slack, which you've all been invited to message any of us or message each other. You could use the general chat to ask these kinds of questions like, hey, I don't know how to find out when my food service company is. Does anyone else have some tips? Or so use the tools that we're trying to make available to you.